saying that President Cyril Ramaphosa would study the merits of the DA court challenge, and only then will he decide whether or not to oppose it. To discuss further, we're joined by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze. Professor, thank you for being with us. Is this a winnable fight for the oppositions?
I'm not sure at this stage because the approach that's being followed by the government and by President Ramaphosa is to say that first of all, ultimately, as part of a judgment of a court, they very often determine who must pay the costs. As part of the judgment of the courts also, it will determine whether this was done as part of the function or the responsibilities of the president, or whether he did it in his own capacity and for his own interest. And that is part of the 2006 agreement between then just Deputy President Zuma and the Mbeki government, and according to the President Ramaphosa, that agreement is still in place. I think what might be a different interpretation is that the money spent by the government or by the state on President Zuma since 2009 until last year, there's 15 million or more, can still be recovered theoretically if ultimately President Zuma has been charged, he has been found guilty by a court for corruption, racketeering and fraud and the other charges. Because that by definition will then mean that he has acted in his own interest and in his own capacity, and not as the President of South Africa or the MEC in KwaZulu-Natal. So that is at this stage the approach. I think what the government does not want to do is to say we take the decision on our own and put the onus on former President Zuma to repay it, because they will argue that there's no foundation or there's no principle at this stage that they can use that will survive in law or in court in order to enforce that. So it's a longer term approach therefore, but ultimately when President Zuma is found guilty, then they will recover it. However, if President Zuma is acquitted from the charges, then obviously it will not be seen that he paid for something that could be seen as a sort of a prosecution of him without foundation. And I think that is the sort of the options that President Ramaphosa or the government wants to include at this stage in their approach.
Yeah, the idea is, isn't it, that if you're a state official, in the line of your duties, you could make decisions that are unpopular. You could be accused of very many things, and you don't have to pay out of your own pocket as long as it's in the line of duty. The state will support you if you are not found guilty. Presumably the EFF would like that protection as well. Is it fair enough?
I think in general, when the minister, for example, takes a decision about something which is not in the personal interest of the minister, or even if it is a president, and someone is harmed by that decision or feels that that decision was unfair, and take the minister or the president or other senior official in government to court, then the principle applies that they didn't do it in their personal capacity, and therefore the state must pay for the legal costs. That principle has now been pulled through also to the case of President or former President Zuma. And I think what they therefore try to incorporate is to say that if there's in the end no proof that President Zuma did commit corruption or fraud or any of these other 16 charges that have now been imposed, and he's acquitted, then he won't suffer financially. Otherwise, if the principle is now already established that he must pay for all his legal costs, then he can suffer financially, and although he is then innocent. And I think that is the side the approach that the Ramaphosa government wants to adopt, is to say we want to be seen to be fair towards President Zuma, so that there can be no way in which we can be accused that this is a type of a political witch hunt against him. And I think this is the main approach that they want to have in order to also be seen to be fair in the way in which the prosecution of President Zuma will be executed.
Okay, so this will play out in the courts, and we'll see how successful this challenge is by the DA and the EFF. But in the meantime, is this a new nkandla, a new issue for the opposition parties to hammer on about?
I think they are going to focus very much on this. But in the case of Nkandla, it was very different. There was the Public Protector's report. The Public Protector's report, as part of its remedial action, was saying President Zuma must pay a certain amount that should be determined for the upgrades that were done at Nkandla. With respect to this current situation, there is no such document or statement in both from an official source as all in terms of law that can be enforced in order for him to pay this. So it will have to be that the current government, President Ramaphosa and his ministers, will have to take a decision which they cannot necessarily enforce to try to force President Zuma to pay that money. It will be interesting to see what is going to be the approach of the opposition parties, the DA and the EFF. If it is a political approach, the DA now tries, today took it to court with an application that it must be reviewed by the High Court. But we will have to see to what extent this is going to be successful. Being a person who is not an expert lawyer, still I think it will be an uphill struggle for them to convince the court that indeed President Zuma must take responsibility for those costs.
Yeah. If they are successful, or in the meantime there are a few electioneering points to be had, will the ANC be very disappointed that the former President Zuma's tenure is still so influential in the public debate?
Well, that is definitely the case, and I think the moment President Zuma will start to appear in court, we are going to see much more of that. Because then, to some extent, the public debate and the public news will be very much dominated by President Zuma, and it will take us back to the middle 1990s. It will take us back to the arms deal. It will take us back to the time of President Mandela and Deputy President Mbeki, and the decisions that were taken then, the role of French companies, as well as then the role of MEC, Jacob Zuma then. So I think we must anticipate that there will be a lot of focus on former President Zuma. I think what the ANC does not want to see really is that it's going to dominate the period of the election campaign leading up to next year's national and provincial elections, because it can be negative for the ANC. Though President Zuma wasn't the president then, it is still in reflection on the ANC, and it will be a negative reflection. So I think from that point of view, President Zuma's public prominence in the media and the news, in the public debates, are far from over.
You're hinting at an irony perhaps then that it would actually be better for President Cyril Ramaphosa if his predecessor did not face justice. If the country didn't watch justice being done, it would actually be better if he skipped the country or something like that.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I think it is just about the timing of it. We are fast approaching the period where all the political parties are going to start with their election campaigns for next year's election. We are almost a year from the election, and anything negative from any of the political parties, whether it is the Patricia de Lille situation or the Ethel Trollip situation in the DA, or whether it is about former President Zuma in the ANC, or anything else, is going to be exploited by the different parties in the election campaigns. And I think all the parties therefore want to minimize the controversies that can be used by the others against them. And the court case against President Zuma is going to provide a lot of ammunition for the opposition about the accusations of bad administration, of corruption, of the way in which the ANC governed for more than 10 years. And that will the basis be on which a lot of the campaigning against the ANC will take place.
Professor Kotze, before we let you go, just a quick issue, and understanding that you're not a legal expert, but could this come down to a technical matter, whether the state attorney should have appointed the lawyers or whether he was entitled to appoint his lawyers? Because it does make you think that if there are no limits, as a public official, you can appoint the best lawyers at any cost and use any number of them.
Well, as I understand it, that normally depends on an internal agreement between the person involved, the politician involved, as well as the state attorneys. So the appointments that took place, in my understanding, would have required the approval of the state attorneys also. I think the other aspect which is not yet part of this discussion is that we are talking mainly about the spy type court cases, but the Nkandla court cases that went up to the Constitutional Court appears not to be part of this discussion at this moment. The EFF wants to pull it into the discussion, but at this stage it is mainly confined to all the court cases that the DA started with and that ended last year with the judgment about the setting aside of the decision, or reaching the conclusion that that decision about in 2009 about setting aside the charges against President Zuma was irrational. So that covers that specific aspect. But the other court cases in which President Zuma was involved appear not to be included in this discussion so far. And I think over time they will become part of that discussion, so it will become much more complex, because like in the case of Nkandla, that has been concluded. It will be exceptionally difficult therefore to recover the legal costs incurred by President Zuma in that respect, because there is not anymore a charge in the pipeline and a final judgment by a court that is still outstanding.
Yeah, and can he afford all those millions? Thank you, political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze, with us from our Pretoria studios there.